Thank you, Shalidra. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be in New Zealand, it's great to be in Auckland, and it's great to be here actually supporting something that I think is really important. So for you to organise yourself around a transformation agenda in construction, I think it's a massively important initiative. As Shalidra said, it's something that's akin to my thinking around what we need to do in the UK, and much of what I'm going to talk to you about over the next 3/4 of an hour suggests we have some rather generic issues in construction that span international boundaries, and hopefully make some of what I say of relevance to you here in New Zealand. Not everything will work here. You have a very different market in some respects around the size and shape of your construction industry, and some of the background conditions are different as well. But I'm hoping that at least some of what I'm going to talk about has some resonance, perhaps leads you to think a bit about how you might take some of the principles away and make them relevant for here in New Zealand. So Do Not Resuscitate was the title I was given, which links obviously to the title of my 2016 government review, Modernise or Die. And really how I'd frame that is effectively a challenge that I'm laying down to various stakeholders, which I'll come on to do things differently. And I think that's what this is really all about. This is about the need to do things differently rather than the same old, same old. I suppose the opening question is, well, why do we need to do things differently? And my premise is that business as usual in the construction industry isn't an option anymore. And I'll come on to why I think that is in the next few minutes. And as I've said, I think some of the drivers for change that now exist and some of the reasons why we have to change are actually the same between UK and here in New Zealand. So this isn't something from the other side of the world that hasn't got a relevance. I think there's going to be some nuancing around it, but the reality is I think there's some very common themes. And having been in Australia last week as well, presenting at a conference there, and I know Australia's a different market in itself from New Zealand as well, it's clear to me that there's some common challenges that we're all facing at the moment. So just a bit of context around my report. So it was published in late 2016. It was commissioned by the UK government for two reasons. One was to look at the house building challenge that we had. And at that point, David Cameron was our Prime Minister and had made a manifesto commitment to build 250,000 homes a year throughout the UK. At that point, in early 2016, we were building about 140 odd. So effectively a big sea change required to deliver against the housing need that was developing in the UK. And one of the reasons that I was asked to undertake the review of the labour model was that there was a growing concern from government that this wasn't just about land availability, it wasn't just about the planning system, it was about construction and its capacity to deliver that number of homes. So my terms of reference were quite clear. It was looking at the way the construction market works. It wasn't specifically to look at technology, it wasn't specifically to look at collaboration, albeit both of those key things are absolutely integral to what I talk about in my report. It was just to look at the functioning model of how we deliver in the construction industry. And my report is probably the latest in a line of quite well-known reports in the UK dating back to the early 90s. Which look at the ills of our industry, and lots of what has previously been said gets repeated in my report, and that was always going to be the case. There's no big overnight change in what we're facing. The symptoms of what we're facing as an industry are common and are long term, so I wasn't expecting there to be any big change in that. But if I was to look at the symptoms of failure that I identify in my report, and there's 10 of them, and you'll recognise many of those no doubt as being things that are issues for our industry and have been for a very long time, very deep-seated. They're all symptoms of a core diagnosis of a problem. So these are just manifestations of something that's going on in our industry that's much deeper. But there's 9 symptoms there. The 10th one was the one that I really came to think very early on in undertaking my review felt different this time. Hadn't been covered in the previous reports I've just highlighted, and actually was going on in the background with not a real amount of coverage, certainly in terms of trade press or public discussion. And that's that one, the workforce size and demographics. So through an early analysis of the data, through census data and other statistical evidence, it was quite clear we were entering a different phase around a resourcing challenge for our industry that we haven't seen before. So we have in the UK a couple of things going on. One is we have Brexit, which many of you will be aware of in terms of the UK's decision to leave the European Union for whatever reason that might be. That's what we've decided to do. And we have a migrant-dependent construction workforce. So in London, for instance, 50% of all of our construction workers are non-UK, 25% of them are actually EU nationals. So we have a big risk around a decline in our workforce in terms of both people wanting to go back to their home countries, but also a lack of ability to access future flows of EU workers, subject to how our Article 50 negotiations play out with Europe, and time will tell. But we have another issue which is much more insidious, and that's not to do with Brexit, that's about the age profile of our workforce. So we have an ageing population in the UK, as most Western economies have, but in the construction workforce we have an accentuated profile of ageing, which suggests that for the next decade we're entering a period where more people will be retiring every year than are coming into it, which is linked in turn to the bottom left issue and the image of our industry. So the ability to get youngsters into our industry is getting more and more challenging. The willingness of youngsters to consider construction, whether it's in the professions, in design or project management or surveying, or working in the trades on a construction site, is becoming more and more difficult, particularly the latter. So the societal change we're starting to see is affecting the willingness of kids to consider construction based on a pretext of, wearing a hard hat, a high vis, working on a cold, wet building site, poor health and safety. All of the stigmatisation we have as an industry is starting to affect even consideration of the option. And that is perpetuated, certainly in the UK, by school teachers and careers advisors often actively advising kids not to come into construction. It's seen as a last resort, which I think is a complete tragedy, because our industry, and we're all in it in some shape or form, I think we'll all agree is one of the most exciting it can be in terms of fulfilling fulfilment and creating stuff. Everything we do, we're creating stuff which is unique, and you can't really say that if you're selling insurance or working in the shop. And I think that that's a point that's often lost on a lot of people. And what that means, that 10th symptom of failure, for me, suggests we are entering a new period of declining industry resiliency. What do I mean by that? So our construction is naturally cyclical, it's boom and bust. What we do is highly attuned to economic cycles, and when there's a boom, we really go for a boom, and when there's a decline, it's a real decline. And CapEx in construction is discretionary, so it's one of the first things to get switched off. And what that's meant, certainly the UK's labour model has characterised itself by a move to subcontracting. So very few large businesses now hold their own workforce. They rely on subcontracting to deliver the specific trades that are required to do construction. So you have a tiering, you have a fragmentation of the market vertically, with main contractors employing subcontractors, with the lack of willingness to take on a payroll burden, lack of willingness to take on a fixed overhead, wanting to be fleet of foot so it can ride those waves of up and downturns in a way that its business can survive. Because if you're holding too much fixed costs, then that's a problem in a downturn. And that's really, that resiliency has been enabled by every time we have an upturn, we just drag labour off the street and get it into our industry in some shape or form, and we were able to increase output. What I'm saying is that actually the reduction, the structural reduction in our workforce numbers means that that's going to become more and more difficult going forward. Certainly the prognosis for the UK is pretty worrying. And that's why I say we have a burning platform. It's an overused term, but I do truly believe that we have that issue in the UK, but I would suggest it's a New Zealand burning platform as well. My prognosis in a bit more detail is a bit scary. So skilled labour in decline, as I've already said, both in trade, working and professional and technical services. The quality of the new backfill labour coming into our industry is declining. Some of that is around the quality of the courses that are being run and the ability to skills transfer. And that's because there's a shrinking pool of experienced people that are less and less able to transfer their skills onto a new cohort of talent coming into our industry. Main contractors not in control of subcontractors, and I'll develop that thinking shortly, around the fact that the tiering of the market I've talked about around tier one contractors who engage with clients and then subcontract the work, that's a very fragile model. It's increasingly becoming a fragile model. It's all about skills. It's not just about business management or poor business management, it's a structural issue related to skills in our industry. And then in turn, we're seeing issues with subcontractors not even in control of their own workforce. Some of that's linked to the casualisation of the workforce. We have nearly 40% of our workers in the UK are self-employed. They're basically not on the payroll, so they decide where they work, who they work for, what they want to get paid, whether they want to turn up for work in the morning actually. That's a highly volatile set of circumstances around resource predictability. We also have a problem around designers being de-skilled. So in the last 30 years in the UK, we've moved to what we call design and build procurement. So rather than traditionally architect-led, client design team-led design, actually design goes so far and then it gets chucked over the fence to a contractor and their teams for the specialists to continue that design thereafter. And what that's meant is there's a whole wave of architects and engineers now who don't understand detailed construction design. They do concept design or design up to a point of procurement, but actually don't understand how things get built in a way that enables them to inform their design with that kind of thinking. And I don't want to overgeneralise, but that is definitely something that's happened and it's discernible in the UK. And surveyors, quantity surveyors, and I am a QS by training, are increasingly removed from understanding how cost is made up. So the way in which transactions are being brokered now and the procurement models that are being used means that the detail behind a quote is less and less transparent. So the labour, plant, materials element, the waste, the productivity is becoming less and less visible to people up and down the supply chain, and the QSs work on either side of transactional boundaries. And that's a danger as well around understanding how we're going to solve some of the issues in our industry around productivity, certainly. We're seeing a wave of disputes now starting to come forward, mostly around project failures, again linked to skills. Whether it's design skills, management skills, trade skills, we are having problems down to the fact there's not enough good people in our industry to deliver what we say we're going to do. And highly poignant in terms of recent events, we are having more and more commercial failures in our industry. So we've been through a relative boom period in the UK of 4 or 5 years of big growth, and actually our insolvencies are going up. Seems counterintuitive, but that really is a function of what I've said earlier. Everyone's lost control. The ability to hold risk, the ability to transfer risk, the ability to sign up to an outcome in a labour scarce market is declining. And don't expect that to go away anytime soon, is my suggestion. And then against all of that, really interesting, we've got these new disruptors coming into the market saying, do you know what, we're going to do some things a bit differently. We're not going to respect the status quo. We're not going to do things by the book. We've got a different model. Maybe some of these disruptors are from outside construction, maybe they're from tech, maybe they're from other sectors. But what that's doing is it's creating a sense of disturbance in the market that it's too early to say as to whether this is going to accelerate things. My suggestion is it will. And it's all about actually jumping over a sort of very slow level of progression on our industry and just jumping straight to first base and leaving parts of the industry behind. And just really to make this relevant for New Zealand, the ageing issue that I've referred to appears to be an issue in your market as well. So talk of structural labour declines in the UK, I think is something that you have an issue with here in New Zealand as well. It was certainly something that cropped up in Australia last week when I was speaking there. You look at an international comparator, you look at Japan, it's one of the most aged workforces in the world, in a developed economy. It's lost 30% of its construction workforce in the last 14 years. And that's where we're heading in terms of other Western economies that are slightly behind the demographic bow wave. But Japan tells you how bad it might get around labour scarcity, and that is generating in turn issues with their ability to deliver major infrastructure. They have a slightly different housing model. As you know, they've got quite an industrialised single-family housing model, but their commercial construction, their major infrastructure, including things like the Tokyo Olympics, is massively under pressure because their workforce is declining. And just to put this in the context of construction costs, so these are two graphs, New Zealand and UK, showing construction costs over the last few years, very similar, general trend upwards. My prognosis is that actually you're going to have that mass volatility of pricing, and that's probably over-exaggerated in terms of the graphic, but it's for effect around showing an up and down volatility of labour price elasticity becoming an issue in our market. And the regression line in terms of where costs are going to go is only going to be up on the long term. You're going to see dips because you're going to have supply and demand-led volatility in the market around labour rates and even materials to an extent, but the long-term regression line is steepening. all down to the supply of labour. Labour is going to be a key determinant of construction costs going forward. Even in downturns, the level of downturn you'll see in pricing will be less than what we may have experienced in previous downturns. So what was the challenge that I set out for three parties: clients, the industry itself and government? So I said we need to train and retain more homegrown talent, so about domestic sustainability of workforce. Don't rely on migrant labour if that's something that's a risk, and certainly in the UK that's a risk. You need to start creating more long-term and attractive career opportunities to start filling the pipe at the other end around new talent coming into the industry. We need to change the narrative, what our industry is about. But ultimately, my suggestion is we will not recruit our way out of the demographic attrition challenges we have coming forward. In the UK, we have a multiple of about 6 or 7 to 1 of for 6 to 7 people leaving for every 1 person coming in at the moment. We will not increase our attraction by 6 times. It will not happen. So we will have a declining structural labour force, which means we have a productivity-led issue. That's what it all boils down to, it's productivity, which means we have to do more with less. We need to move to a different model of delivery, and to move to that different model of delivery, and it's highly relevant for your ITA initiative that you're running here in New Zealand, you need to create a new type of demand. So this is about push and pull. So the industry pushing a new way of working is no good if actually clients and their advisors aren't receiving it and pulling it. So the need for a new type of demand around what our construction industry has to do is massively important. And we need to use that demand, once it's visible and transparent and it's at a large enough scale, to start underpinning a new skills and training regime. Because to do things differently in the future, we'll need different skills. This isn't going to be about doing what you do at the moment with your existing models and structures, with your existing skills and training, but just doing it quicker. This is different things we're talking about doing, or certainly the balance of skills is going to be different. And I think, notwithstanding all of that, which is pretty depressing, I must admit, that necessity you might feel from everything I've just set out, is that enough for our industry to change? I don't think it is. My past experience of the UK is our industry listens to nothing. It absolutely doesn't recognise, even if it's about to get run over in the middle of a motorway and there's a bus coming towards it, it will not change until it's too late. But there's something else happening now, which is why I think the timing is really important around the change agenda, and that's discontent. And what do I mean by discontent, and how it might be the father of progress rather than the mother of invention? Well, there's 2 types of discontent I'm seeing increasingly in the industry at the moment, and the first is from within the industry. And these are a series of headlines, all from the last 12 months in the UK, all relating to major contractors, some names you might recognise, others you might not, who've all lost money or made next to nothing in a period of big growth, large turnover increases. Ultimately, they haven't been able to commercialise that into a sustainable model. And that culminated in the failure of Carillion, which some of you might be aware of, the second biggest UK contractor, £2 billion sterling of losses, a further £1 billion of pension fund deficit, all down to the fact that they'd lost control, linked to skills. Skills in the boardroom in the case of Carillion, not just skills on site and the management of their projects. They had major problem projects in the Middle East, in the UK. Some were government projects, but some of them were private, and they just lost control. Their ability to deliver the outcomes they contracted to around lump sum fixed price contracts were not deliverable on the basis of their subcontractors weren't able to deliver them in turn, because the subcontractors weren't able to deliver the workforce, and actually they mismanaged the whole strategy of their business as well. So the answer to that headline from July last year we now know, which is no, it can't recover, and it is now in liquidation. It's one of the biggest corporate failures in UK history. And what that's meant is the title of my review has attracted a bit more renewed attention in the last couple of months as to everyone's now knowing what I mean by die. So I never meant the construction industry is going to die. This is what I meant. This is corporate failures. This is businesses not able to survive in a different climate where the ability to deliver outcomes is becoming more and more challenging. So this is the biggest example of die that you may see. My fear is that there's more to come, and we've got some other big corporate failures or M&A activities to come in the UK. So this is a big deal in terms of long-term change and the reasons why this is not a flash in the pan. This is a symptom. Again, it's the 11th symptom perhaps of something that's going on in our industry. Yeah, and guess what? You have some similarities here in New Zealand. And I'm not an expert in your market, but you have a polarised tier 1 position here where you've got serious financial woes being expressed by one of your major contractors. You also have issues in your infrastructure delivery market. So it's not just about house building and commercial construction, this is about infrastructure delivery. So again, I think there's a read across from UK to New Zealand as to what I'm saying here. And then there's another level of discontent, and that's from the end consumer. So in the UK, we've had a big issue in the last 12 to 18 months with construction quality, particularly in home building, which is one of the more emotive construction sectors that is all about the public either renting or buying property, one of their biggest investments perhaps. And some of the stuff we're producing in the UK is shocking, all linked to skills. This is about skills. Everything I'm saying here is about skills and labour and the ability to deliver, whether it's a design or it's a piece of brickwork or it's a timber stick building or it's a waterproofing detail, it's about skills. So Bovis Homes, which is a top 10 house builder, nearly went bust about a year ago because social media was mobilised by a bunch of unhappy consumers, purchasers, and went to the papers, went to TV and said, look, come and look at my house and see all the rubbish that I've been given by the builder. And that nearly sunk that business. They're now on a turnaround programme, but it's symptomatic of a much deeper seated issue around house building in the UK linked to resources. It's also happening in social housing. So that is a scheme in East London, built 3 years ago. It's been condemned. The whole building's been condemned through moisture ingress, poor air quality, poor detailing. And that's a tier 1 contractor that's built that. It's been signed off by building regs, it's been signed off by the architect, and it's going to get knocked down. Skills. We've also got it outside of housing, we've got it in social infrastructure. So we have a big schools programme in Scotland where they found systemic failure in masonry detailing. So a brick wall fell on a playground, nearly killed a bunch of kids. And then they explored 5 or 6 other schools, it's the same issue. Wall ties hadn't been put in to the sufficient amount and hadn't been supervised, and all of this was covered up, no one knew. So it's reflecting a very poor state of affairs around construction. And now it's starting to affect our infrastructure programme. So we're building a new nuclear power station in the southwest of England. It's right in the middle of nowhere and we've got no labour. No one wants to go there, no one wants to travel there, no one wants to go on a labour camp and work in the middle of Somerset. All they want to work is the major cities in the UK. So there's a big question mark how that's going to get delivered now. And even our poster child infrastructure project, the biggest infrastructure project in Europe, Crossrail, which is £16 billion sterling, it's been a fantastic job for the first 4 or 5 years as a civil engineering project. Now it's a building construction project because we're fitting the stations out. High intensity labour, M&E, joinery, carpentry, painting, decorating, finishes. It's become a nightmare. We haven't got enough people, they're not trained to the right calibre, we've got labour disputes going on, and what was seen as one of the better jobs in the UK is now just another construction job. And guess what? You have some issues here in New Zealand which intimate you have quality issues as well. And ultimately, that's why I think there's generic issues that span both our countries, to different degrees perhaps, different nuancing, but there are definitely issues here that I think are common. Last summer, we had the tragedy at Grenfell Tower, where over 70 people died in London, which took all of this discontent to another level. So what was maybe an issue with just an abstract issue around construction performance became highly politicised. It became an issue of national importance around, well, what was the story behind how this happened? And the public inquiry hasn't played out yet, but it will undoubtedly shine a light on the construction industry, how the building was commissioned in terms of its client procurement, how it was bought, how it was designed as well, how it was built on site and supervised, how it was handed over and managed. And without wanting to jump the gun, there's likely to be all sorts of issues that arise here that are symptomatic of wider failures in our industry in terms of how it was designed, how it was tested and certified, how it was installed, in the competence of the people that were involved in that project was assessed, etc., etc., etc. What that's led to is a review of UK building regulations. So we have a big review going on as we speak. This was a flowchart that was prepared before Christmas to show how our building regulations work in the UK. So if anyone understands how that works, you're a better person than I. But it shows you actually something's not fit for purpose here. And don't get me wrong, we work in a complex industry, so sometimes that might need complex systems to control that. But this has lost its way, and it's become something that is actually becoming a blocker to efficient and effective competence and supervisory sign-off of buildings. And what the review is going to likely indicate when it's published later this year is that the process, the skills and competency needed to deploy the process are going to get harder, and the level of compliance and enforcement is going to get harder as well, just at a time where we've got a reducing workforce and less skills. So this is a pretty bleak prognosis around the challenges we have getting even harder with less people to face them. As I said, the issue of quality in the home building industry is a massive one. It's become highly politicised. The government are talking about it every day at the moment. This is our housing minister, Sajid Javid, who's now actively looking to interfere in the market and regulate, which is something the Conservative government is not usually being that prone to do, but it sees a big problem with house building quality and construction competence, and is now talking about bringing in an ombudsman for consumer complaints into house building, which will be the first time that's happened in the UK. At the moment that is regulated. It's not regulated, it's led by warranty businesses and guarantee businesses managing consumers, but the government is now going to step in. What it's also doing is recognising that modern construction, which I'm coming on to in a second, also has its own challenges around making sure whatever we do around changing our techniques has to be to the utmost standard. So there's no point building stuff in factories actually if you're repeating an issue. It actually could be worse in a factory because you get systemic failure rather than random failure on a construction site. So this is a working group, and I'm actually chairing this working group for the government at the moment, which will release its findings later this year, which is about trying to open up the mortgage market and the finance market and the insurance market into modern methods of construction, which includes off-site manufacture and new materials innovations, so that we can get that market functioning around the money, because all of this needs funding, and if it's not fundable, it won't happen. So you can do all the innovation in the world, you can do all your strategy around changing the way you build. If the mortgage companies won't touch it or the building insurers won't touch it, it won't happen. So this is a massively important initiative. It's all about quality, it's all about skills, it's all about competence to do things differently. So what do I talk about in my review? I talk about leadership, and that's relevant for today and what Shalidra said in her opening statement. This is about leadership. And that could be central leadership of some strategic direction for the industry, but actually we need some leadership from within the industry as well. And we need that leadership from clients, industry and government. There's no particular point of our industry here that or the stakeholders that I'm pointing out to. We need it amongst people that are commissioning the construction industry, people within the construction industry, and government has a role to play here in engaging in the right way. Government won't sort out our issues, it won't solve our woes, but it could steer us in the right direction. So leadership comes from all of those parts of the equation. We need a productivity-led change agenda. Comes back to everything I've been saying. We need to prepare to do more with less, and we need the future skills development to be driving the agenda here, not current skills shortfalls. Because if we keep hiring what we feel we need here and now in the short term, we'll make a big mistake. We need to start transforming the skills we need on a long transitional journey towards a mix of traditional skills and new skills. Not overnight change. This is a feathering in of new techniques of how we build, how we design, how we supervise, how we logistically integrate value chains. But it needs demand for those courses to be run in the colleges and the universities. So unless you have that demand for a new way of building, no one's going to run those courses. So it's chicken and egg. And government does have a role to play here. As I say, it's not in itself going to change our industry, but it can be a progressive client for its public works programmes, and it can use policy to help the industry on its way. So it's an enabling role in many respects. And really, if I was to pick out two themes that underpin my entire review, it's the 2 points at the bottom. So what I'm saying is if we're going to change our industry, we need to move to higher levels of pre-manufactured value. What do I mean by that? That's simply the proportion of value that's delivered prior to a final piece of work going into the work phase on the construction site. So it's a level of consolidation. So that could be raw materials and components, it could be hybrid assemblies, it could be panels, it could be volumetric pods, it could be full volumetric. But actually, as you increase the pre-manufactured value, the PMV, then actually the likelihood is that you're going to be more productive, you're going to be more effective, you're going to be able to give a more predictable outcome because you're overcoming the site-based risks of delivery that we're seeing more and more, as I've already said. But you also need to do that through a more integrated delivery model. You need to change the shape of how we deliver construction projects, which is about procurement and organisational design. If you do one without the other, you won't change anything. This is a complex problem, and it actually needs a systems-based approach to how you drive change. And these are two of the major dimensions of change as I see them, certainly in the UK. So this is not about saying we're going to use BIM, because I think the mandate proposals for BIM in the UK has actually put the cart before the horse. This actually is the horse. The drivers for change is looking at how we change the delivery model and how we integrate ourselves differently to deliver that model in a modern way. And why do I say that? So for me, the reasons we fail are down to these 4 issues. We bespoke design everything we do from scratch. Every job an architect or a designer will just start from a blank sheet of paper. There's no common backbone that we use to create an element of uniformity. We're too site labour intensive. We default to a suggestion that we have to do everything on site when we don't. We're too vertically fragmented, so we're tiered, as I said, main client in using a tier 1 that then subcontracts. There's tier 3s and 4s and suppliers. Every transactional interface is waste. It's adversarial behaviour, doesn't move anyone forward. It's managing bits of paper effectively. And then we're too fragmented horizontally because we work in trade silos. So your M&E guy will work differently to your carpentry guy, will work differently to your finishes guy, and every interface between those working boundaries is a risk on site of mismanagement and coordination. And to move that forward, you have to do 2 things, which is the 2 points I raised on the previous slide. We need to move more towards high pre-manufactured value delivery, which is hybrid construction, and more manufacturing thinking in construction. Not necessarily full volumetric. Don't get me wrong, this is not just about big pods turning up on the back of lorries. It's a different way of thinking around a spectrum of delivery that moves you more towards manufacturing and construction. And you have to move to these integrated procurement models that I speak about. And then digital, this is where BIM comes in. Digital is the enabler for that. So there's no point putting BIM out there if you're not reforming some of the other issues around procurement and physical delivery model. So digital enablement for the whole process is massively important at that point. And what do I mean around this issue with BIM? This is what I see in the UK at the moment around BIM. So I see varying degrees of BIM. So if you take level 2 BIM, some of you will be aware of that as a protocol, that's being used with traditional adversarial competitive tendering through contractors that are variably engaged with BIM as a point of process in terms of data protocols and common data environment and workflows. And then it's being deployed with analog construction. Just guys on sites building the same old way. So your models at the front end, your 3D clash detected Revit models or whatever it might be you're using, actually become irrelevant when you're building the job on site because it's an analog construction process. So that for me doesn't work. And if you keep pushing digital without changing the construction process on the site or the lead up to the construction process on the site, you are effectively putting lipstick on a pig. And that's what I'm telling the UK at the moment, that you need to get the order right around your change agenda. Digital is an enabler, it's not the be-all and end-all if you're using stuff that is still in the dark ages as your means of production. You've got to change the means of production. And what that's meaning in the UK, some really interesting developments around things like delivery platforms. So this is a really important document that I would recommend you all to read. If you Google it, you'll find it, it's free issue. It's delivery platforms for government assets. It's about delivery product platforms for government spend programs, including prisons, hospitals, schools, defence assets, using the same thinking that you get in the automotive sector, product platforms. So basically a kit of parts that you can mass customise. You have various parametric design parameters that you work to that enable you to manufacture to a standard. You have an open source supply chain behind it. That means you're not necessarily linked to a specific system, albeit systems can also speak to this as well, but you can have more open sourcing of manufacturing that delivers to designs where architects have to use a kit of parts. They're not allowed to go away and just design bespoke. They can still bespoke their facades, they can still make sure that the placemaking is done, but use a bottom-up approach to design that fundamentally changes the design process. So you start to get a digitally enabled process. This is all digitally enabled on using Revit or whatever it might be. You're moving to the top right space rather than going straight to volumetric, which is a capacity limited play in my view. There's not many volumetric players out there and not many schemes will take full volumetric. You're moving to more breakdowns of schemes where manufacturing enables a bespoke solution but with a standard process of manufacturing thinking. And what that does at the moment, we have a market failure barrier in that we're not able to get to the top right, but if you design differently, design for manufacturing assembly, DFMA, then you'll get to the top right. It just needs mass take-up, needs some leadership from designers and clients who are going to approach their buildings a different way. And it enables you not to avoid cookie cutter design as well, because the worst thing in the world is to have manufactured buildings that look all the same. This enables you to customise your buildings, but you have a language and a library of components. Just to give you an idea of construction as manufacturing, what does this look like in the UK? So we've seen some interesting developments around aggregation. So I'm aware you have a large SME component to your market here in New Zealand. So this is not about big set piece factories. We have a few of them in the UK starting to set up, but we have a very big SME sector as well. So how does all this work with SME thinking? Absolutely, it's about collaboration. It's about smaller businesses coming together perhaps in little collaborative hubs and coalescing to share inter-trade working, or even similar trades or competitors even coming together to share best practice so that they can share fixed costs as well, maybe factory costs. So factory share is an initiative that was set up in the UK a few years ago. It hasn't really taken off, but it's coming back. It's having a renaissance now around opening up a safe environment where small businesses can work under one roof and actually combine their products in some instances where they might have worked on a site. They can actually pre-assemble and actually have the cost of where they're working shared and actually part government funded even. We're seeing some really interesting stuff in Scotland. Scotland's actually ahead of England in this regard around timber framing. So using digital computer-aided manufacturing techniques where CSIC, Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, has opened up a collaborative R&D initiative. You've got 7 or 8 of the big timber framers in Scotland all talking to each other, which is unheard of, sharing, well, what's best practice? How do you get efficiencies in the factory around your production? What's the best machinery to use? How do you get the process better and then go away and actually go back to your own business and still compete, but you've actually shared some of the learning for the greater good of the industry? And that's a template for a much wider application in my view. We also have got some really interesting small businesses. Carbon Dynamic is a Scottish timber business, started doing like chalets and lodges for back gardens, now doing houses, using digital manufacturing, even augmented reality. So do not think digital technologies and SMEs are mutually exclusive, because they're not. It's all about mindset. And what they're doing is they're using that digitalization as a brand point of difference for their business, because it implies high quality, implies 21st century, implies a different way of doing. Facet Homes is another, same as Carbon Dynamic. We've got, even in the refurbishment market, we have small businesses taking on modular approaches to build. Loft extensions, which is a big thing in the UK. We've now got businesses like this one. This is Landmark Homes, business in London that prefabricates the roof extensions and roof conversions. And this is all done and dusted in a couple of days. That could take 2 or 3 months done traditionally. So low intervention into the building, low issues with neighbours in terms of the construction process, all about thinking differently. Wikihouse, some of you might have heard of Wikihouse. If not, I suggest you Google it. Wikihouse Foundation is a not-for-profit initiative in the UK looking at open sourcing digital componentry for delivery platforms that I spoke about. So it's coming forward, it's going to open source stuff on the web. It's all web enabled, so any architect can go online. There's no firewall or paywall rather, and you can just use their kit of parts. And actually the idea is to then assemble a supply chain behind it that responds to that kit of parts and gets itself organised around, I can do your Wikihouse design. Whether it's a panel, whether it's a bathroom, whatever it might be, it actually backs into a manufacturing platform. Just moving on to procurement, what do I mean about the procurement failures? Well, I've spoken about most of this. Vertical fragmentation, tier 1 contractor, loads of subcontractors, massive horizontal vertical fragmentation, no control or ownership. My view is that model does not work anymore. We need to disintermediate, it's a big word, but actually we need to get rid of the people sitting in between the people who are paying for the work and are doing the work. And actually that means more of a bias towards smaller businesses, SMEs, specialists, not intermediaries who are cash flow led, that are sitting there, a la Carillion, just trying to manage your risk around other people's cash. Actually the link to getting close to the people that do the work has to be improved. And that moves to what I would term is more of an alliancing model. And alliancing is where the future sits for me in construction, not in tier 1, tier 2 hierarchical procurement. And what you have to do is effectively drive a multi-party contract where your client, you're probably a manufacturer sitting in there somewhere if you're going to increase your PMV, some of the residual specialist trades that you still need, the designers, and what I call a construction integrator, not a contractor, an integrator, all sit around the table at day one. They're all procured on a different way based on outcomes, and you drive it on a programme of work. This doesn't really work on one-off jobs. You have to link it to programmes of work. So this works on infrastructure programmes, it works on housing programmes if you tie them together strategically, not just buy a job at a time. You can then link it to insurance products. So one of the things we're looking at in the UK is how you simulate a lump sum building contract by getting an insurance firm to sit behind it on a cost guarantee. And actually they will need technical assurance of the process, so it's an even better enabler of process assurance for the whole piece. And the money does not go through a tier 1. You have a project bank account where the money is held centrally. The specialists get paid directly by the client. There's no skimming that goes on. Everyone gets paid their margin in the way that it should. But this is a much more transparent process and it's digitally enabled. Secondly, I'm going to talk very quickly about Heathrow. This links to a presentation I gave in Sydney last week, where Western Sydney Airport is being proposed as a new piece of major infrastructure. Heathrow is a private client. This is not government. This is a private client in the UK, owned by Ferrovial, the big Spanish investor contractor. They're looking to expand their airport, third runway at Heathrow to keep up with demand, and they're going to do it through a high PMV solution. So their intention is to probably target 65-70% PMV across the whole programme of works at Heathrow through logistics hubs. So they're purposely setting out a strategy, and this is years in the future, but they're starting now around the procurement strategy to maximise the amount of value that's pre-manufactured, not done on sites. They don't want to have loads of workers on sites because they don't have any workers in London anymore. This is the issue. They're worried that on the back of Terminal 5 and other major infrastructure projects, that labour cost inflation will derail the job, actually quality will go down for all the reasons I've already spoken about. Let's get it done in a factory, let's get it done elsewhere in the UK where there is labour and it can be done to a more predictable outcome. And that's what this initiative is about. They're currently out to select 4 logistics hubs across the UK, out of 60 plus that have applied. Real interest here. And those logistics hubs is not one building, it's a coalescence of different supply chain members all working in a coordinated network in a location, not necessarily on the same industrial park or whatever. It can be in a town or a city, but they're all networked, they all talk to each other, they all know what each other are assembling. They might pre-assemble a consolidation phase before it comes to Heathrow in London. But this is the principle of this. This could be made a regional, this doesn't have to be a country thing, it could be a regional municipal level initiative. And it's about rebalancing economic growth. So London is taking too much of the economic growth in the UK, so this is a way of spreading the love and getting the economic growth wider across the UK. And then, in turn, creating a demand for those new skills I spoke about. So on the back of these logistics hubs, there's going to be new colleges, new courses being run around logistics, assemble, manufacturing, hybrid construction, that is driven by a demand that's being made visible. So again, it's demand-led skills transformation. The packaging strategy is very embryonic at the moment, but it's going to be buildings and civil engineering. Even the civils piece that you might think is just earthworks, diggers and concrete will be elements of pre-manufacturing. A lot of the big structures will be precast. They're going to avoid wet trades as far as possible on site. They don't want scaffolding, they don't want temporary works, they don't want propping, they don't want plaster, they don't want concrete being done at Heathrow if they can help it. It's a completely different philosophy around design. And they're also going to use a delivery platform. So the product platform design for all the buildings will come off a common catalogue of components, and the architects will be forced to use it, that then link to the logistics hubs and supply chains. So coming back to the earlier slides, you're driving the behaviour around your design process into the supply chain. So in closing, There's a lot going on in the UK at the moment. There's a lot of businesses that are out there doing things differently. This is not some big overnight radical transformation. A transformation program by its very nature is a program. It's a series of activities that need to happen. It's a series of awareness issues. The last 12 to 18 months for me has been, my personal involvement in the UK has been awareness building. My report can't change the industry. What it can do is increase awareness. We have some problems, we have some unprecedented problems, and we need to get on with sorting them out. But it comes back to leadership of driving those changes through. These businesses have taken personal leadership. These are businesses where the boardroom has said, you know what, we need to do something differently, and they've made individual decisions to lead on that, whether they're clients, whether they're contractors, house builders, housing associations, institutions, investors. They're all going out there on front. They're not waiting for someone else. If everyone waits for someone else, nothing will happen. So we need real leadership in amongst all of this, and these businesses are showing that. So, in closing, so modernise or die is a call that's echoed around the market. In the UK, it's caused a bit of a stir, which is good. It's created a conversation that perhaps we haven't had for a long time in construction. Everyone's trying to think, what does that mean for me? Carillion has really added some oil to the flames around, you know, I don't want to die. I don't want to be another Carillion. And this is not just about tier one businesses, it's about consultancy businesses, it's about SMEs and tier twos. What are you going to do to safeguard your business? Because that's what we're talking about here. How do you get the right skills for the future? How do you modernise your delivery programme? And this is a generic international challenge, I would say. New drivers for change I've spoken about. We have a skills crisis, we have discontent, but we have this massive opportunity around technology and thinking differently. Take the opportunity, don't let the risks and the challenges overcome you. And we are lucky in the UK, and you might not have this in New Zealand, but hopefully you'll have a move towards it. We have a UK government that's woken up to the fact it has a role to play here. It's taking a leadership position. And it can't change the industry on its own, but it can help, and it is helping. And it's a massive plus for us at the moment, at a time when we need as much help as we can. And I think ultimately, if we're all going to change either of our industries, UK or New Zealand's, then we just need that industry-led change, that leadership. Everyone in this room and outside this room needs to decide what part do they play. It needs to involve clients, it needs to involve advisors of clients, it needs to involve financiers and funders. They all have a key role to play in this. So, that's me done. Apologies, I've probably overrun a bit on time, but I thought I'd just give you both bells, as I'm not in New Zealand that much. So hopefully that's provoked some food for thought, and happy to take questions. Thank you.